All right. All righty. Can you guys hear me? Okay. I know more people are going to keep joining us, but I want to get started because of time and to respect everyone's time on this beautiful Friday. So welcome everyone to our Lunch and Learn, Understanding and Addressing School Avoidance. For those who do not know me and for all those new faces, my name is Olga Marable. I am the Director of Admissions and Outreach for Fusion Academy Rockville. I want to share briefly with you about what Fusion is for those who are unfamiliar. So Fusion Academy is a revolutionary private middle and high school serving 6th through 12th grade where positive relationships unlock academic potential. All courses are one-to-one, one student, one teacher per classroom. This allows teachers to customize curriculum and teaching for each student's individual strengths, interests, and learning style. Our supportive campus environment is a unique space that includes a state-of-the-art recording studio, mixed media art studio, and a homework cafe, where students complete all their homework before going home. Flexible scheduling lets students enroll at any time of the year through rolling admissions and take classes at a time of day that works best for them between 7:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. In addition to full-time or part-time schools, we also offer tutoring support and over 250 course offerings. We offer a fine balance between academics as well as social emotional support through the homework cafe, clubs, and activities. While we do have 85 plus campuses nationwide, the DMV has 7 campuses, including our DC campus, Loudoun, Reston, Tysons, Alexandria, Rockville, and Columbia. Our campuses still have openings for the second half of the school year, and we are starting to enroll for summer. So definitely inquire today if you are interested. I want to go over a little bit of housekeeping with everybody. So as I mentioned, this is being recorded. Feel free to turn off your cameras if that makes you more comfortable. I will be sending the recording as well as the slides to all of you by the end of the day Monday. Do keep yourself muted until we get to the Q&A portion, then you're definitely welcome to get off mute. I just want to make sure that we don't disturb the speaker. Your name in the little black box, please make sure that it is your name, especially if you are going to be asking questions. I want to make sure I address you by the appropriate name. You'd be surprised how many people still have their kids' names or their spouses, their name. The chat will remain open throughout the entire presentation. Feel free to utilize it for collaboration, networking. If you want to put your questions in there, definitely throw them in. We are going to hold questions until the end for a Q&A section, but if you want to throw the questions in, I'm going to hold on to them until we get to Q&A. And if they're not addressed throughout the presentation, I'll go ahead and ask on your behalf during Q&A if you'd like. When we do get to Q&A, please keep your questions appropriate and not too personal. There's a lot of people joining today, and we just want to make sure that we are respectful of your individual situation. So I want to go ahead and utilize the chat really quickly because there is a lot of people here and it's really exciting.
No pressure.
No, I want to know who's here. So go ahead and utilize the chat and throw in your name. If you're a parent, feel free to mention your child's grade. If you're a professional, you can include your company, your title, your contact information. But I really want to have a fun little tidbit about each of us to get to actually know each other. So throw in your favorite memory in the snow. And I'll share mine first. So my favorite memory in the snow is my dad would always shovel the driveway and make a really big pile of snow. Like he would put it all in one big pile and we would dig out a hole to make an igloo. Like that's what cool. Every time we made him just put it all in one pile. As a grown-up, I see how hard that is to move the snow into one pile, but I'm very grateful. So feel free to utilize the chat, throw in your name, who you are, basically your contact and your fun memory. And I'll give you guys a second to answer that. Hi, Hong. Hi, Brenda. Hi, Teresa. Welcome. Welcome, Maryland Coalition for Families. I see a lot of you guys are joining today. Flooding, obviously. Oh my gosh, these are going so fast. I can't even read through that. Making igloos also. Yay. In Michigan, I bet that was a lot of snow. I mean, I grew up in Montgomery County. We every now and then. This is why it's a memory, because it happened rarely. Hi. Falling from my back gate into the snow. It's great. Oh my gosh, so many fun memories. Oh, I love it, you guys. Keep throwing it in there. I would love for you guys to all get to know each other here and just see the joy that the snow can bring us, even when we feel a little bit inconvenienced by it. All right, so I am going to move on. I did want to mention quickly why I chose this topic to have as our Lunch and Learn topic. It is something extremely relevant to Fusion Academy and our students. In fact, at our Rockville campus, a third of our students this year have a school avoidance background. So right now we have about 65 students total. That's 20 students on our campus have a background of some sorts of having school avoidance. So this is something near and dear to what our students are experiencing, and we're just seeing in the community as a whole. And we are able to support these students greatly for many reasons. One is that for our students, if they miss a session or miss class, they're not missing any material. And that is really a big piece of the—
I would like to schedule an EMG, please.
Oh, sorry. If they're not in class, they're not able to make it through the door today, that's okay. When they come back tomorrow, they're just picking up where they left off. They're not missing material and falling behind with their peers. They also get to do homework at school with help, which reduces the anxiety. Again, if something doesn't make sense, they have the support at school. We can ease our students into classes. We can start them with 1 or 2 classes. They show up consistently and then adjust to having 3, 4 more classes, customizing their schedule. They can also start virtually and ease them to come into person. At our school, we don't have the traditional environmental triggers that a traditional school has. So a lot of our students just aren't going to experience what they may in a traditional school setting. They also have a really strong sense of belonging and purpose when they are in a smaller community and having a relationship with their teachers and peers. So this is how we tackle it for a lot of our students, and why we're seeing success for the students who come to us with school avoidance in other school settings. But moving on to today's speaker. So our speaker today is Dr. Megan Doyle. She's a licensed psychologist with the Sticks Root Group in Maryland, who specializes in assessment of children and adolescents with learning, attention, behavioral, social, and emotional differences. She strives to understand the whole person and how they move through various contexts and environments: home, school, structured, unstructured, social situations, etc. As a parent of 2 neurodiverse children, she values a neurodiversity-affirming approach to assessments, which recognize the many strengths and positive attributes of different types of thinkers, as often the challenges neurodiverse students face stem from having to navigate a world that was not designed with their brain in mind. Dr. Doyle believes that for students to thrive academically, socially, and individually, they and their families need to understand how their brain works, recognize the strengths that they can capitalize on, and understand which areas of vulnerability require additional support. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Doyle.
Thank you, Olga. I really appreciate that nice, thorough introduction. And I really wanted to say thank you for everybody that is coming here today. I mean, I know that we all are incredibly busy with our lives. We have jobs, we have kids, we have responsibilities and commitments, and it's really meaningful that all of you took the time to come here today. You could have done a lot of other things, and so thank you for joining us today. As Olga mentioned, I am Megan Doyle, or Dr. Doyle. I really go by Megan, and I'm a licensed psychologist. And like she said, I specialize in kids neuropsychological evaluation for kids ages 8 to 18. And one of the things that I think is really, I'm glad that we're talking about school avoidance today, because I've noticed, that an uptick in, parents reporting school avoidance behaviors, particularly, since COVID, really. So this is an incredibly important topic, and I thank you all for sharing it with me today. So I wanted to go over our agenda for the day. we're really going to be focusing on, what is school avoidance or refusal? What are the factors involved in school avoidance? School avoidance, many of the school avoidance behaviors have certain functions and they can follow a behavioral profile. We're going to talk about assessment, school avoidance do's and don'ts. We're going to briefly review interventions and supports and resources. So, as Olga kind of mentioned, I want this to kind of be a collaborative process. So please, questions that come up, don't hesitate to throw them in the chat, and so that we can have time to get to them at the end. So, let's kind of start by defining like what school avoidance, is, and why it's important for us to talk about. There you go. I was looking for our little banner that has everybody in attendance. So school avoidance or refusal is when a kid, really has a hard time either going to school or refusing to go to school at all, or has difficulty staying in a school setting for a whole day. It can include things like, excessive lateness or missing entire or partial school days or skipping classes. This absenteeism is, something that interferes with everyday functioning, of the students' academic achievement, social relationships. It affects their relationship with peers, their relationship within the family. And a lot of these school avoidant kids, they fall behind in their classes, and they start to, feel disconnected from their classmates and teachers. And they really miss out on a lot of opportunities to learn how to handle anxiety related stuff and then cope with any of the challenges that the school day brings. And it's really, really important for us to know more about school avoidance, as I mentioned before, as seeing this kind of uptick since COVID. But also because, up to around, some researchers are saying up to about 28% of students experience some kind of school refusal behaviors at some point throughout their academic career. So it's really a lot more common than I think a lot of people think it is. So, when it comes to, why we've seen this uptick in school avoidance beginning with COVID or since COVID is that, a lot of researchers have started to kind of see that like some students really got really comfortable and accustomed to, socializing and learning virtually. Nowadays parents are more likely to be working remotely and staying home from work. And so that can kind of make it easier sometimes for some kids to stay home and avoid school. But as I mentioned, it really can wreak havoc on households. I mean, I know that Olga, you mentioned that there are a lot of parents here. I'm sure that they would agree that it is wreaking havoc on their household. Families often share that it can be just exhausting or overwhelming. Sometimes it's even heartbreaking, particularly if there's some social, concerns or bullying, and overwhelming, scary, and isolated. Right. And it's important for us to know about this because school avoidance is associated with a lot of other problems, right? Many kids that avoid school are struggling with anxiety or depression. Some, are engaging in substance abuse or risky behaviors. It's really impacting, negatively their social functioning and their relationships with peers. And if school avoidance isn't kind of caught early, it can increase a student's risk for other things that are not related with good outcomes, like major depression or poor mental health, problems at work, problems with relationships, like over dependence on their parents, or failure to launch, and just kind of generally having adjustment problems as adults. Right. So even though this might happen as a kid, it has long-term implications for these kids when they grow up. And, most importantly is that, as a psychologist, I work with students who are experiencing depression and anxiety or neurodevelopmental disorders or learning differences, right? They might have special education needs. And these are the kids that are actually kind of the most vulnerable. And so as a clinician, I also felt it was important for me to better understand this. So I really like this quote from Eli Leibovitz, who is an anxiety specialist. He wrote this great book, OCD or oh, I'm blanking on the name of the book. I'm so sorry. I'll get back to you. But he the way that he describes it is, attending school feels like being trapped in a job that, they hate, that aren't allowed to quit. I'm sure all of us have had jobs that we absolutely hated. And what did we end up doing? We quit, right? We found better employment elsewhere. This is what these kids are going through. It's really hard. So school avoidance, what is it, right? For these kids, school feels so difficult and overwhelming, right? And that overwhelm is contributing to these significant feelings of distress and anxiety about attending and staying at school. So to relieve that anxiety, they begin to avoid aspects of school or going to school altogether. And while this can be really helpful or a really good solution in the short term because it provides that immediate relief from the feelings of distress, it's not a long-term solution because these kids get stuck in this vicious school of avoidance cycle, right? So we have these repeated absences from school. And when we have more absences from school, our level of engagement with school, with teachers, our connection with peers, classes, subjects, all of this starts to kind of tank, right? And then when we're not feeling good about our relationships or our academic performance, then we then feel worse about ourselves. So we're actually exacerbating mental health issues, which then leads to further absences from school when, the cycle is not disrupted, right? I really like, this quote from Jonathan Dalton, right? And he says, anxiety and avoidance are teammates, right? Kids feel uncomfortable when they go to school or think about going to school. So they do what evolution teaches them to do, and that's to avoid something that is scary, right? School avoidance is a really complicated thing, and it's multifactored and it has multiple functions. So before we get into kind of the factors and the functions, I want to kind of go over what is not school avoidance, right? School avoidance is not laziness, right? It's not that your kid is lazy. Your kid is not, trying to intentionally manipulate you or make your life more difficult, right? In the real world, people can choose where they want to work or where they want to go to college, but like students in a traditional school system don't have that level of flexibility, right? School avoidance, a lot of times it's really hard for especially the younger kids to kind of explain what it is that's upsetting for them at school. And so they might look like they're being really, really oppositional. But really it's that they need more support, right? There's some underlying unsolved problems or skills that need to be addressed. And it's not manipulation, right? Like in some instances, like this is their body's fight or flight response or anxiety response. And school avoidance is not a diagnosis, so to speak, right? Like it's not in the DSM-5, which is the manual that we use to diagnose people as psychologists. And it really is more of a symptom of an underlying condition or unsolved problem, which then ends up kind of propelling the avoidance. So there's lots of different factors related to school avoidance, not to get too complicated. More often than not, there is definitely an interplay between all of these factors, contextual factors, family factors, and individual factors, right? And it's important for you to know that there are multiple factors and that there is an interplay because when it comes to talking about intervention and supports, there really, really needs to be a team approach. I can't stress this enough. So let's kind of briefly review what the contextual factors are. One is school climate, right? School climate is kind of this broad concept that involves, safety or, social aspects of the student's educational experience, academic opportunities, disciplinarian practices. It's related to things like, guns or violence or bullies, and that includes cyberbullies. Discipline practices and how culturally sensitive is the school responding. And then it can also include community variables like dangerous neighborhoods, criminality. Teachers and school staff contribute to school climate, right? I mean, I think that it's really hard to be a teacher, in 2024, right? I mean, after especially coming out of COVID, a lot of these teachers are overworked and underpaid, and they're not supported the way that I think that they deserve, to be. They're not provided with enough resources, and in some ways, they're already asked to do too much with not having enough support, which is kind of the recipe for burnout. Another factor related to school climate is that sometimes there are certain schools where the curriculum just doesn't match what the student needs. I mean, that's kind of one of the nice features about Fusion Academy is how flexible Fusion Academy is with, adapting the curriculum to meet the students' needs, right? So school-based, curriculum that students find or perceive to be like tedious or inflexible, right? Like, having rigid schedules or the consistency or support of interventions or availability of interventions. Their school's willingness to, modify workloads or assignments, that contributes to how kids feel about school. And then finally, poor communication between, school staff, students, and family members is related to school climate, right? I mean, sometimes there ends up, when you've got a kid who's avoiding school, what ends up happening is that, like, sometimes is that there becomes this kind of adversarial relationship between the parents and the school. One is blaming the other, and no one is doing anything kind of about the problem, right? And also, there are some educators that have a hard time kind of separating someone's neurology from their character, right? Like, if someone is kind of hardwired to be really anxious, right? It's not that they have like a major character flaw, right? But because teachers then see the behavior of, oh, you're not, they're lazy, they're not coming, they don't care, they attribute it to a flaw in someone's character when that's really just not the case. Okay. So the next thing is the next contextual factor has to do with parents and families, right? Lack of resources is a contextual factor, right? Some parents might be really stressed or have low concern or motivation to address their kids, avoidance styles, right? There are certain parenting styles and family variables that are, kind of associated with school avoidance behaviors. Most particularly the interaction patterns of, like, when there's a lot of high levels of conflict and isolation and low levels of cohesion or adaptability, those tend to kind of be good breeding grounds for, school avoidance behaviors. And then there's, parent mental health issues, right? Parents who might be anxious, who have a really hard time, coping with their own anxiety, often have a hard time guiding their kids through uncomfortable situations. And, while they are often well-intentioned, they end up, sometimes over accommodating
So I
their
was trying to run
kids.
before they started.
Which then allows them to avoid because it reduces everybody's anxiety, right? And then, of course, there are family systems issues, right? These are, frequent changes in schools, parental incarceration or poverty or, significant financial stress. And then there's individual factors. These are often kind of child-based risk factors. They can include kind of, variables like within, like, and often include variables kind of within the child beyond, like temperament, can include like confidence or achievement or mental health, right? Health problems are an individual factor, right? If you've got severe allergies or you're immunocompromised, it can be really scary sometimes to go to school, especially since everybody has stopped wearing masks, right? Most often we see school refusal with, internalizing disorders like anxiety or depression. And these internalizing disorders often kind of create a sense of social isolation, which is a contributing factor to school avoidance. Um, Separation anxiety disorder is one of the most common anxiety disorders, primarily in kids under the age of 12. And, a disproportionate share of younger kids who engage in school avoidance behavior also have some separation anxiety. And, for those of you that don't know what separation anxiety is, it's this significant anxiety related to being separated from, their parent or primary caregiver. They worry about something bad happening to their parents, while they're away from each other, that makes being separated feel really, really intolerable for them, right? They worry about being lost from them or kidnapped. And then social anxiety is another big contributing factor. We see this more in school avoidant adolescents, right? And social anxiety is this really like intense and persistent fear of being watched or judged by others, right? Socially anxious people are intensely afraid of being humiliated or judged or rejected, such that like individuals would rather just nope out of the situation altogether than to potentially risk being embarrassed or centered out, or demonstrate observable signs of anxiety. Um, Socially anxious kids also makes it complicated is that they often have, fewer, strong, tight friendships, and they feel lower levels of, support among the peers that they're friends with. And so, if you don't feel like you're getting enough support, or you don't feel like you can come to your friends with problems, again, this contributes to this feelings of isolation, and reduces, motivation to go to school and increases anxiety about going to school. And then, of course, depression also co-occurs, with anxiety, right? And that's because, these anxious kids are really, really stressed and they're really anxious. And they're, being stressed and being anxious is also really tiring. So, I mean, so Bill Stixrud, the founder of the practice that I work at, it says that the recipe for depression is, a brain that is too stressed and too tired and too anxious for too long. So it's not surprising that we see, symptoms of depression in socially anxious, school avoidant kids, right? So things like sleep disturbances, or low energy or motivation, or even, being self-critical or self-loathing can really contribute to social withdrawal and wreak havoc on a kid's, self-esteem, social adjustment, as well as academic achievement, because they're all interrelated. Use Kids with learning differences can also be at risk, right? They might be really frustrated by, not being able to keep up with their peers or not get the concepts as fast as they see everybody else doing, right? Or, they might not have the right support, or instructional modifications that they require to really, demonstrate their abilities. And then, of course, low academic achievement is another factor that can potentially increase school avoidant tendencies. And then we have our neurodivergent folks, right? We've got the, externalizing behaviors or emotional dysregulation, that we often see in, ADHD students. That can contribute to like, risks of being, or can make them more vulnerable to being bullied, right? Which then can contribute to school refusal. And a lot of ADHD brains have co-occurring, learning differences or graphomotor weaknesses, which can make certain subjects or certain aspects of school, like writing, harder for them and increase their desire to avoid, or their motivation to avoid. When we think about kids that are like kind of the most vulnerable, it's really the kids that have both co-occurring autism and ADHD. And then, of course, there's autism, right? What the literature on school avoidance and autism points to is that, in addition to having higher rates of school avoidance among autistic brains, school avoidance behaviors tend to start to emerge earlier. My sense is that from reading the literature is that it usually happens kind of during periods of transition, right? So transition from elementary to middle school in particular is considered challenging for many of our autistic brains. And also, folks with autism are more sensitive to and influenced by like school related stress factors, right? We've got, bullying, right? Or academic performance, changes in class or teachers, right? Transitions are like, occur a lot in the later grades, right? And those are harder sometimes for autistic brains. And also just the sensory component too, which can also apply to our ADHDers, right? They might be sensitive to bright lights or noisy corridors, right? That could send them into this sensory overload and then increase their anxiety. So you can imagine how hard it is for, an autistic student to trying to manage all of the stressors on top of academic pressure or perfectionism. All of that can seem really overwhelming. So it's, not a surprise that we see, increases in school avoidance behaviors. There's also the social communication differences, right? That can make navigating peer relationships harder for these kids, right? For example, they might take, something that a peer said literally and, think that they're bullying them. Or conversely, they might not always realize that like the people they're hanging around don't necessarily have their best intentions, in mind. And one of the things I thought was really interesting when reading the literature about it is that for some autistic kids, it's hard to live up to kind of the social expectations related to the student-teacher relationship. What's expected? How am I supposed to advocate or ask for help or advocate for myself? And that was kind of influenced by, on an individual level, the teacher's understanding of autism, which I thought was really, notable. The autistic brains that are kind of most vulnerable are the ones that have really high social motivation, but weaker kind of social competency skills. They're at the highest risk of developing school avoidance, as well as depression. Okay, and then of course there are other factors, right? These refer to kind of early adverse experiences like trauma or school violence, victimization, medical problem, grooming, abuse, discrimination. Okay. So now we're going to spend some time talking about the school avoidance functions, right? Because all behavior has a function. School behavior or school avoidance tends to be more often than not a gradual process, right? It might start with missing a day or two, and then or coming late for a while, right? And then all of a sudden they're missing a week, and then they're just avoidant altogether. As I mentioned earlier, it's more common as we kind of see through transitions, right? So between elementary and middle, or middle and high school. And the definition, as we mentioned earlier, is that it's the student motivated avoidance or refusal to go to school or stay at school throughout the day. And there are 4 different functions for school-related avoidance behaviors. One is to avoid distress, right? The other is to escape or avoid social or performance-based activities. Third is to get attention, usually from, a preferred person, right? Like a parent in the case of separation anxiety. And others are to obtain rewards outside of school, right? When you think of that, you think of the kid, the 15-year-old who's skipping, last period to go and, hang out with her friends instead of being in school. Presentations can often, function by presentations and functions can vary by age, but all of them are maintained by negative and positive reinforcement. So, just to kind of briefly review what negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement are is, negative reinforcement is kind of think about it as I am going to escape or avoid something so that I can temporarily relieve my anxiety or distress. We see this negatively reinforced school avoidance behaviors more with kids with anxiety disorders, right? For really young kids, it's often related to, specific fears, like they want to stay away from objects or situations at school that make the child feel like really like unpleasant and uncomfortable or distressed. And they usually kind of try to avoid school altogether. You see this with school-specific fears like being on the bus or certain people, like a teacher or a principal or staff or a peer, right? Issues with transitioning from the playground to lunch or from class, to lunch or what have you. And the behavior is often associated, with the avoiding distress. When the young kids, they often have trouble kind of saying like what it is that's bothering them. And that's developmentally appropriate given, their language and emotional development. So you might just hear kind of patterns of like, I hate school, I don't want to do this. This is awful, right? Or complaining about stuff that's general and they can't really specify. And you also might see some excessive crying or irritability. It's also what's common is some feigned illness, right? Like, I have a stomach ache, my head hurts, I can't go to school. What's really important for you to know about the younger kids that have that kind of school-specific fear is that they're often really concerned about not being in school and missing things. The other, the second one is to avoid or escape social and performance-based activities. This we see a lot more in adolescence, right? So performance-based activities, would include, something as simple as like answering a question in class or asking for help, going to assemblies, working on group projects, having to navigate unstructured peer situations, you know, and then of course bullying. And then there's kind of more evaluative type presentations, right? Like that could be having to give an oral presentation or a speech, you know, getting called on in class when your hand wasn't raised, even having your picture taken, or, you know, doing something, performing some kind of act in front of other people, singing in front of other people, going to PE class, reading or writing in front of other people. Okay, so then positive reinforcement is I'm going to escape or avoid school in order to get something, right? We see this with kids, as I mentioned, with separation anxiety or, you know, externalizing disorders like ADHD. These kids, the ones that are trying to get something, they are not distressed or anxious about missing school, and you know they often have kind of tantrums or disruptive behavior, either before school or during school in order to be sent home. This is at the younger years. They also might ask for kind of excessive reassurance. They might want to frequently call home. Is my mom going to pick me up at 3? Like, is this what we're doing next? Right. And they might, like I said, want to call home or text home or want that reassurance from their parents. The tangible rewards outside of school, that we see that, like I said, more often with adolescents, right? They were the ones, these absences are usually hidden from parents. And they're the kids that want to skip school with friends, or or they want to stay home and play video games online. Okay, I feel like I'm going so fast and talking so fast. I hope I'm not going too fast. Okay, school avoidance presentations can and functions, as I mentioned, can vary by age. School avoidance, the problem often ends up being more harder or trickier to tackle when the student is older rather than the younger ones. And it tends to be a gradual process. And there are active versus passive avoidance strategies. And I mentioned kind of some of them on the earlier slide, but active would include like screaming or crying or tantrums, right? Repeated verbal declarations about how they're not going to go to school, right? In some cases, they might run away from the house or the classroom or the school building, or lock themselves into the car or their room or the bathroom to try to avoid going, or potentially cling to adults like, don't leave me at school. And then more passive strategies, are, refusing to get out of bed, or, the car or the bathroom, or like dragging their feet in the morning, like really slow, despite you as parents being like, okay, we have to go. We have 5 minutes, right? As well as physical complaints, stomach aches, headaches, what have you. Another thing that's really important for you to know is that, it includes, physiological or somatic components, cognitive components, and behavioral components. And often, there are these kind of sequences of school-related distress. Younger kids, it usually starts with kind of the behavioral or physical stuff, whereas with adolescents, it's more like kind of the physical or cognitive stuff. So what do I mean when I talk about the sequence, right? So let's say they're starting with the physical stuff, right? They're gonna wake up with somatic complaints, right? They might have physical anxiety symptoms like, muscle tension or stomach aches or trembling, and then they have that thought, well, I feel sick. I feel sick that I have to go to school, my head hurts, right? And then we have cognitive aspects of it, right? So that's kind of self-efficacy or threat estimation. It's going to be awful. I know I'm going to fail, right? They might have irrational or unjustified beliefs that no one likes them, or that they're certain to fail. What's notable is that, like, a lot of socially anxious folks often experience more kind of subjective anxiety and fear related to negative evaluation. So they have a lot of these automatic thoughts about how other people perceive them, right? Others will think that I'm stupid or strange or unlikable. Oh, I don't, or about other people, or they have these awful thoughts about themselves, right? Oh, I don't have anything interesting to say. I'm not interesting. I'm not an interesting person. I'm just going to offend someone. And then they get worried, right? Because they have that physical stomach ache or whatever. They say, oh my gosh, I'm going to puke at school. I don't want to embarrass myself. I can't go to school, right? I'm not going to school because I'll get made fun of or fail a test or embarrass myself. Those are all cognitive aspects of it. And then there's behavior. That's like the things that we can see, right? Avoiding certain events or, fleeing upsetting or uncomfortable situations. This is the tantrums, the crying, the skipping class, the running away, refusing to get up or move or transition out of the house. So, in order to, figure out like what's going on with, my anxious kid that is, starting to refuse school, it's really, really important for you to do some assessment, right? First and foremost is, diagnostic clarification, right? Like, is there an underlying, disorder or condition that is impacting their ability, right? Is it anxiety? Is it autism? Is it ADHD? Is it a learning difference that has gone, undiagnosed? We really need to know, really need to have that diagnostic clarification in order to best address, the school avoidance, because certain types of brains are going to respond better or worse to certain types of interventions, right? And then there's a really great measure. It's called the School Refusal Assessment Scale, the SRAS, and it's actually an internationally recognized measure that's actually been translated into several languages. There's both child and parent report forms that are actually available in Chris Carney's book. I don't know if you guys can see this, but this is really good, or available online in the public domain. What is great about this measure is that it helps identify like what the function of the behavior is, right? Is it to avoid or is it to get something, right? Is it negatively reinforced or positively reinforced? It identifies the reinforcers so that you can kind of develop this school avoidance profiles. And then certain profiles kind of map on to other, kind of related vulnerabilities like anxiety, depression, or stress. On it, there are 24 questions. 6 questions are each tapping one of those 4 functions that we reviewed on the previous slide. The next thing that's really important is, interviewing the parent and the child, right? Like you want to know, like how much school are they attending? How long of the day can they tolerate? Are there contextual or school climate or individual factors that are playing a role either in, precipitating or maintaining the avoidance behaviors? What's the parent's response to the kid's anxiety, right? What's their academic standing? Are they anxious on the weekends too? You really want to get a wide, a deeper understanding of like how these behaviors kind of play out, when they play out, and what everybody's responses are to them. And you want to get this information both from the parent and the kid. And then, attendance monitoring is also a really, really important part of, kind of generating or developing a plan to address school avoidance. Attendance monitoring should be done at home and at school. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to track common school refusal behaviors. And again, that book, Carney's book that I showed you, has a lot of great examples of like behavioral logs to track said behaviors. Again, both parent and the kids should track their behaviors, right? And what we're getting at is we want to rate the kids' levels of distress throughout the day, right? So that we can then, over time, start to notice some specific patterns, right? We're looking for common school refusal behaviors, and then we're looking for common patterns, right? And when we're tracking behavior, we're looking to do this over a matter of like weeks. It's not just like one day. You want to do it. You want to have a good sample, and larger data set. So you want to do it for a couple of weeks. And we're always going to be looking for patterns, right? Like, do you notice that that school refusal anxiety spikes after holidays? Do you notice that it happens during a specific day or during a specific subject or class with a certain teacher or situation, like PE class or tests or group projects or presentations? You want to see if this is kind of an acute versus a slow ramp up of these school avoidance behaviors. You want to see, well, how are they doing socially, right? Do we notice that there are more school avoidance behaviors when, there's dust ups or, social conflict or tension with their friends? I also want to talk a little bit about what not to do if you have a school avoidant kid. The first thing is don't blame. Don't blame anybody. Like, no one is served well by blaming other people, right? I mean, a lot of people blame the kid. They think that they're lazy or unmotivated or all these things, right? A lot of people try to blame the parents, right? That they're ineffective or permissive or indulgent. Blaming and shaming people does not help the problem ever in any situation, right? And for all of you parents out there, like, I empathize. It's really hard to parent an anxious kid, right? We are hardwired as parents to respond to our kids' needs and distress, right? And so it's hard to then kind of enforce rules or expectations, because especially when you've got a kid whose distress manifests in such large, big, explosive ways, right? Um, it's also, as parents, it's a lot easier to kind of step in and try to rescue our kid, or change the way that maybe we would otherwise handle, the situation, because we need to just reduce that anxiety. We need to get them back to baseline. And that, can work in the short term, but again, like this, it ends up creating more problems later on in the long term, right? And that's because when we do jump in and save, we're kind of taking away a lot of opportunities for our kids to, try out different problem solving strategies, and to build their distress tolerance. So, really the only way kind of out of this is through it. Can't get around it. You got to go through. It's never a great idea to, like, physically force or coerce or threaten a kid. I don't know of many situations where, like, punishment really is necessarily helpful. A lot of these kids are doing the best that they can. Remember, this is not intentional or willful. This is a kid who's really struggling. So coercing them or threatening them isn't helping anything. You definitely also don't want to ignore the issue and hope it will go away because it won't. um, and then, we also don't want to over accommodate or reinforce the anxiety, right? Instead, we want to help our kids build up distress tolerance, because distress tolerance is a really important life skill that helps us navigate anxiety provoking situations. And then finally, what you definitely don't want to do is give up. I know it can feel like you want to sometimes, because it is upsetting and overwhelming, and it feels probably sometimes impossible to figure out a way through it. But please don't give up, and know you're not alone. Some of the things that you do want to do is you want to make sure that you get a baseline of, where they're, about their attendance and their school refusal or avoidance behaviors. You definitely want to screen for individual factors, right? Like learning differences and autism or ADHD. We want to collect data and identify patterns. Really, what's really, really important is that we try to endeavor to understand the situation from the student's perspective, and then validate them. It's really hard to be a school avoidant kid. And then it's also really important to work collaboratively, both with teachers, school administrators. The kid definitely needs to be a part of this, but also outside stakeholders, right? Like therapists, psychiatrists, executive functioning coaches, tutors, right? This really is kind of a team approach. The one thing when we're talking about intervention, and we've identified the functions, and we're figuring out this intervention plan, and we're getting all of these supports set up, and we're trying to get this kid to stay longer in school, it's important for parents, for everybody to know that you can often expect things to kind of get worse before they get better, and that is a normal thing, and not to get discouraged and lose hope when that happens. And also, knowing that you're not alone, right? That earlier statistic where, upwards of towards 30% of kids experience some school refusal behaviors throughout their academic career. This is more common than we think it is. You're not alone. So I really recommend, joining school avoidance, parenting support groups, Facebook pages, anything where you can be around, feel connected to a community that understands what you're going through. And can offer validation and support. That's really important. Parenting is hard, and we need validation and support. Okay. So now I kind of want to talk about some of the interventions related to school avoidance. These are individual or parent-based interventions. Cognitive behavior therapy is a really good intervention. But even before we start, the cognitive behavior therapy, we really want to make sure that we are providing accurate, like, psychoeducation about what anxiety is, right? Like when we're working with these kids, they need to understand what anxiety is, how it is, and how it is impacting the way that they feel about themselves, like physically, cognitively, and how it affects their behavior, right? And then we want them to participate in cognitive behavior therapy so that they can learn how to incorporate cognitive behavioral strategies to help them recognize their thoughts and understand how their thoughts then influence their feelings and behaviors. Another big part of the CBT, particularly when it comes to school avoidance, has to do with exposure therapy, especially if a kid has been out of school for a really long time, right? And that's because we're trying to build up gradually their tolerance to be able to tolerate that source of anxiety, whatever it is, right? And so this can look, it's going to be a gradual thing that is agreed upon between, by everybody before you get started, but it can include things like maybe it's staying in the car in the school parking lot for a while, or walking to the building, right? Or walking into the guidance counselor's office and then leaving, right? And then we slowly kind of incrementally increase their time at school. Also part of CBT is, teaching kids and parents how to, teaching them avoidance management strategies, right? And these are things that need to be taught or need to be practiced at school and at home, right? The next thing, the next behavioral intervention that's really effective is, dialectical behavior therapy. This is the work of Marshall Linehan and colleagues. And the four main components of dialectical behavior therapy are all really helpful for school avoidance because they involve distress tolerance, mindfulness, emotion regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness. And what is also great about dialectical behavior therapy is that there's a parenting component to it too. So parents can really get an understanding of how to help their kids learn these four components and practice them with regularity. The literature was suggesting also that mindfulness-based interventions have shown some success with school avoidance behaviors in conjunction with CBT and DBT. I wouldn't necessarily think it would just work on its own. But what mindfulness does is it encourages individuals to explore, how they might have a different relationship with their thoughts, right? Or their feelings or their body sensations, right? And to kind of be able to observe with non-judgmental awareness as opposed to self-criticism and shame. And then, of course, medication is a really important, individual intervention, not only just to reduce the subjective level of distress on a day-to-day basis that a lot of these anxious kids are experiencing, but also to increase their psychological availability to be able to participate in the above-mentioned interventions. And then there's also some parent-specific interventions, right? One is SPACE, that's Eli Leibowitz. He's at the Yale Child Center Study, or Child Study Center. And he has developed this parent-based intervention called SPACE, which stands for Supporting Parents for Anxious Childhood Emotions. And what this intervention does is it focuses on changes that the parents can make to their own behavior, so that they can help their child change their behavior, right? The two main kind of components are, to learn how to respond more supportively to their anxious child, and also to reduce accommodating or over accommodating, which is what is reinforcing the anxiety. Okay. I'm just looking at our time here. We're at till 1, right? Okay. So then there's also, general partnerships when it comes to schools. And there needs to be a partnership between the parent and the school. So school-specific interventions are, multi-tiered systems of supports, right? So these are tiered interventions that are provided to students where, tier one, everybody gets, these certain kind of best practices and interventions. And then, tier two would have, the smaller group that needs, maybe additional support or mental health support or behavioral support. And then tier three would be more intensive needs that kids have. And that's, so each tier would be kind of a smaller population of students participating in each. The two models of these, tiered systems of support are, response to intervention, RTI, which was part of the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and then PBIS, which is called Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. So the RTI, response to intervention, was, primarily used for identifying and providing supports for students with learning differences. And that's when, teachers are like, okay, we've identified that this kid, is a little shaky on this. So we're going to provide him with more intensive, services or supports in this area. And then we're going to monitor their response to that. Whereas PBIS, with when it is implemented with fidelity, doesn't just address, just the academic piece. It addresses, school climate, emotional competence, social skills, and has a component for kind of teacher health and well-being as well. The next one is, parent advocacy. It's really important if you've got a school avoidant kid to work collaboratively with the school. Everybody is frustrated and feels, upset and maybe helpless, about how to tackle this, this issue of school avoidance. But it's none of that is going to get solved if there's an adversarial relationship between the parents and school. And then I would also recommend, in terms of advocacy, is that especially if the kid is old enough, they should always be kind of included in those meetings about them and discussions about them, at school and with outside providers. And then, of course, there's also the collaboration between homeschool and outside agencies, right? Therapists, executive functioning coaches, psychiatrists, tutors, things like that. It really is a very much a team approach. The next round that you can go for, general interventions is, getting your kid, a 504 or an IEP plan, right? Kids with school avoidance, some can meet the criteria that IDEA kind of sets out as, a kid with an emotion regulation impairment, right? If you can't regulate your emotions and tolerate sitting in school, you're then not, your engagement in school is going to be much less, right? And it's important for you all as parents to understand that, like, your child does have a right to a free and appropriate public education, which could include accommodations, which are changes, that are made in the way that instruction is delivered, and then or modifications. So that's, changes when a student is taught or expected to learn, right? So the way that they're teaching it. There are, parents should also know that there are no restrictions regarding what supports and services, you can have on an IEP or a 504. So, if you're thinking about how you're going to tackle school avoidance, and attendance monitoring is part of that, like that could be, a service that you put on the 504 or IEP. Okay. So all IEP and 504 supports, though, or services or modifications, are based on the individual's needs, right? And the whole point of getting a 504 or IEP specifically related to school avoidance is the goal is to build a sense of belonging and engagement within the school setting. And so, sometimes there might be, especially in the early days, some short-term interventions that, like, that could then fall off as the child gets more comfortable staying in school for longer periods. And then there's, academic, instruction or modifications that we can make and include on IEPs and 504s, right? Modifying a class schedule, helping to manage student stress levels, right? Maybe don't put them in all AP classes if they, have a hard time coping with stress. Maybe there's late starts or early outs, right? sometimes there can be like the strategic placement of, high demand classes with low demand classes, right? Or, other considerations that can be made, like, having a kid do, an alternate project instead of having to give a speech, especially in the earlier days when, they're still working on building up those distress tolerance skills and exposure. There can be social, interventions and supports that schools can provide, right? Social skills interventions, right? Maybe some kids, need escorts between schools and classes. Maybe they need a peer buddy, right, at recess or lunch, or a little more help or support in unstructured social situations. Um, it's also going to be really important to include, how the school's going to respond to absences, and when I say respond, I mean, how are they going to communicate that to the student, right? In all of the articles that I was reading about this, regarding intervention, they were saying how, like, a lot of students really, their sense of connection with teachers and with the school itself really increased when teachers reached out with a call or a text, just to say, hey, I noticed you weren't in school today, hope everything's okay, right? Just like kind of this call or text that is exclusively about care or concern, not like, and you have 7 chapters to read and all of these other work, right? That's just going to spike their anxiety. But to let them know, hey, we missed you, right? Like, that can go a really long way for a kid who, maybe isn't feeling as connected as they would like at school. And then, of course, there's tutoring, executive functioning coaches, and then educating teachers, sensory accommodations, right? Creating a safe or quiet space, for kids when they're feeling overwhelmed, so that they don't just leave school altogether. Instead, they can go to that other space, right? Maybe transitioning between classes a little earlier so they don't get that sensory overload in the hallways. There's lots of things that can be done. And, we can sometimes get creative with it. It's individualized. What does this student need, right? We've got the data that helps us figure out what's identified or what the function is, what's reinforcing it, and then we use that to help guide the interventions and supports that they'll have at school. And then a big component is educating teachers and staff. I know about neurodiversity, about ADHD, about autism, about anxiety, in a really structured, formal way, so that they can, learn skills to be more responsive to students who are struggling with these things. Okay, and then finally, I want to kind of go over some, autism specific considerations, right? One of the things that I've noticed, kind of anecdotally, is that a lot of the kids that I see who are autistic that are having school avoidance, many of them are actually in a state of autistic burnout. They really are not in a place that where they're psychologically available to participate in school in the traditional way that we see it. Um, and so, in these instances, it may be a case where, they do need to take a leave of absence from school while they recover, and then, work on systematically reintegrating them into school. Autistic kids with school avoidance often have are more complex, right? And they often require multiple levels of interventions and supports. What was really key for getting, school avoidant autistic kids back in school was, a couple of really interesting things. The first was developing a trusting relationships with key adults so that school could feel like a safer space for them, even if they were having kind of social, difficulties with their peers. And also, staff's perceptions of autism was actually another big factor, right? Like understanding, what autism is, how it can, how this kid is presenting, and not taking things maybe personally. And then ongoing support with social skills and friendships development, and then integration within the school community, participation in, after school activities. So let's see. So, kind of in some, it with autistic kids, it's might take a little longer. You might have to go a little slower, and it might be a little more complicated, but that's not to say that it can't be done. They just need special considerations. Okay. Finally, there are some resources that I wanted to share with you. One is the Carney book that I referenced several times, as well as the places where you can find the school refusal assessment scale for parents and students. And then some other, resources like podcasts and websites. Okay. Whew, I feel like I just sped through all of that. I hope you all stayed with me. So I guess, unless we can kind of open it up to additional questions, comments and concerns, if you want to take it away, Olga.
Let me go through the questions that were asked throughout the presentation. We'll start there.
Okay, I'll do my best.
Any additional questions, you guys are welcome to kind of like jump in after. So let me just ask these first. So the first one came up, what did you say was the ASD profile most at risk of avoidance?
So these are kids that have really, really high social motivation and a strong desire for social connection. But their social skills, and with developing and maintaining relationships are weaker.
Thank you.
Yep.
Your previous slide, did that include the books that you were sharing?
Yes.
Okay, great, because everybody was asking for those titles, so thank you.
Yes. Yeah, no, it's great. And again, you can find the questionnaires online. They're in the public domain, which I think is really great.
All right. What about ACT versus CBT for intervention?
I didn't have a lot, I didn't see a lot of information about ACT versus CBT. So I kind of can't speak to that. I'm sorry. I don't want to steer you wrong. So I don't know.
All right. Okay. I know you mentioned exposure therapy. What a person asked, what about exposure therapy? I guess what would that look like?
Right. So, okay. So the premise behind exposure therapy is that, you learn these distress tolerance skills, right? And you, with your therapist and while you're creating this kind of distress hierarchy, right? Like what makes you a little bit anxious, medium anxious, I'm oversimplifying it, but, very anxious, right? And, exposure therapy is when you then systematically kind of, expose yourself to the anxiety provoking thing in order to, what we call learn how to habituate to it, meaning that like, you sit with that anxiety and then all of a sudden after, you practice this, that thing that used to be a little bit scary is no longer very scary. And then you gradually work your way up the hierarchy. So that's what I mean with exposure therapy. It's a behavioral intervention.
Thank you. And last question I have from the chat is, what does attendance monitoring look like as a goal or item on a 504 IEP?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think some of it would depend on, the kid and their age, right? So it could be something as basic as, did this kid come to school that day? Yes or no. Or, it could be, tracking every single class period, right? That would be like kind of on the school side, right? And if you're lucky, you could have the teacher be like, to jot down notes of like, notice that they were visibly anxious during this period, right? And just to get more data over time to see, oh, are they more anxious in Mrs. Smith's class, observably than they are in, Mr. Johnson's class or whatever it is, right? And then at home, this book again has like a lot of these at home logs that you can do. So I can actually show you one if you want to see. So you might do, if you're going to want to track behaviors. I don't have my self view up because I hate looking at my cell phone. Do this. Can you guys see this? Let's see if I can do show self view. There we go. You guys can't see this. Okay. So it goes through and it wants to track the different behaviors. Did they do this Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, right? Because remember, we're looking for patterns of behaviors. And then you can also have them. This is just kind of a regular attendance log, right? Like, did they come this day? Gosh, my camera's not helpful with showing you this. Did they come this day? Did they come that day? Did they come, so, and then there's also both parent and child ratings that take place throughout the day, right? So, parents would rate, well, my kid was really, really anxious this morning. I didn't see them all day, but I didn't get a text from them. So I assume they were okay. And then at home, they weren't anxious, until right before bed, right? And then you want to track that with the students' responses, right? Like, yes, I was really, really anxious that morning, and then I was anxious all the way through school, and then, I wasn't anxious at home, right? Again, we're looking for different kinds of patterns. and stimuli that causes anxiety.
Thank you for answering. I did just put the resources from Dr. Doyle's presentation in the chat for those who are asking for it. It is there too. But I want to open it up for questions. Feel free to come off mute and ask your question. If you're not comfortable asking a question, you can throw it in the chat and I will ask on your behalf.
Okay, can you talk a little bit about school avoidance in kids who may be autism but not diagnosed? Was there more to that question? It says, I know you, and then it went ... Olga, do you see the rest of that, or is that it?
I know your colleague, Dr. Henderson, talks about how ASD kids can mask. No one knows they are ASD. And also Dr. Dalton thinks 40% of school refusal kids are or turn out to be ASD.
Yeah, I would agree with Dr. Dalton's kind of estimate of that. So can you talk a little bit about school avoidance in kids who may be autistic but not diagnosed? So you would likely see, well, I loathe to say, well, it's going to look like this automatically, because, you know, there's the adage, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person, right? But, you know, I would imagine that you would probably see issues earlier on, right? Maybe rather than later, with, you know, difficulties with transitions, not liking school because of related to transitions. But really you can look for that gap between like transitioning from elementary to middle school is when we often see kind of these school avoidance behaviors crop up. And that's because a lot of the social demands, you know, change in middle school versus, you know, elementary school, right? It's not about, you know, oh, Johnny sits next to me and he's my best friend because, you know, we have her in the same class. It's more, friendships are based not on proximity, but on, you know, shared interests and, you know, talking about, you know, other people and our likes and our dislikes and you know, what we're doing. And that can be a little harder for autistic brains, right? Girl world, you know, gets really complicated in middle school, and a lot of it is subtext and reading between the lines, and people are, you know, having crushes, and it just gets to be more complex. And so with that complexity, sometimes we then see, you know, the kids are feeling anxious and bad about themselves and they don't want to go to school. Okay, the other question is the name of the book that is ready, everybody ready? Helping School Refusing Children and Their Parents, a Guide for School-Based Professionals. And it's by Christopher A. Kearney. He's one of the preeminent researchers on school avoidance. And it's a really good resource.
I just put it back in the chat. So anybody who needs it, the title's in there for you.
Thank you.
These are really great questions too. Does anybody want to come off mute and ask a question that they have?
Is anybody brave enough? Anybody socially anxious out there that want to, you know, do a little exposure and ask their question on camera?
I'll ask a question. Hi.
Hi.
So we currently have a client who whose child is dealing with school refusal, and they've been out of school for quite a few months.
Yeah. How old are they? Sorry, how old are they?
Oh, I want to say he's not mine directly, so I want to say 5th grade.
Okay. Elementary.
Right. So I guess my question is, obviously we want to help this family avoid any CPS concerns. So what would you say, like, are there specific programs we can direct the parent to? Are there, they have, I want to say, unsuccessfully attempted therapy as far as I know. So any additional resources that you could throw my way, suggestions, we would appreciate.
Yeah. So do you, well, I would refer you to Jonathan Dalton's practice, you know, who specializes in, you know, and working with school avoiding kids. But what kind of work are you doing with them? And do they have, like, have they been, you said they've successfully or unsuccessfully attempted therapy, but do they have any kind of diagnoses that would then start, could start a 504 or IEP process as like, this is an emotion regulation issue under IDEA, and therefore, they need accommodations and not to
Yeah,
get
and the school has
CPS
been
called.
the school has been working with them and doing their best to meet them and support them. We just want to make sure that we help them get their bases covered. We're providing academic and executive functioning support.
Okay.
So but we just want to make sure we help them in the best way we can to cover their bases, so they are safe and doing, not in any danger of that.
Yeah. Well, we don't want this kid to be labeled as a truant, right? Like, right. So that should help with the 504 plan should help with that, right? But getting them involved with a cognitive behavior therapist is helpful, as well as like doing that assessment in terms of like having the parent and the child like figure out what the function of that behavior is, right? Like why they are avoiding school. Is it because of some underlying learning difference, right? Is it because of, anxiety or depression or ADHD, or, like we really want to identify that before we can even think of how we're going to go about approaching it, right? So it sounds like you're still kind of in the kind of data, you need more information in the data collection, which can then help you guide you to where you're going to go, right? What avenue to take.
It sounds like if they have that information, if they have the 504 in place or the IEP in place, that protects them.
It should,
Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because this again, remember, this isn't this isn't on purpose. This isn't manipulation. This isn't, like this kid is really struggling. And like if school sees this and, parents see this, who are they worried is going to call CPS?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess that's a very good question. I guess in my mind, my brain went to, oh, that's been a really long time since they've really been in school.
It's hard.
Let's make sure that all protections are in place.
Yeah. And also you could think about, well, you could also think about, seeing if their education can be supplemented, at Fusion Academy, right? So that we're not getting a lot of that learning loss. See what the kid can tolerate, maybe they can tolerate the structure at Fusion or another independent school that, as opposed to a larger public school.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, we can talk.
Yeah.
I have a question too.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is the right place for it, but we're looking at Fusion as something for our daughter, but she doesn't have any particular educational learning difficulties, but more social ones. So how would Fusion work with that?
I mean, Olga, did you want to, talk about how Fusion can work with that? I mean, before you jump in, like my assumption would be like, it is a less kind of, overwhelming environment, rather, over a traditional school, which could help to kind of ease their levels of stress and anxiety and increase their availability for learning. And then my sense is that Fusion Academy has, a much more kind of flexible, approach, right? Like what is the individual student's needs, rather than saying, well, this is what we do and you need to fit into our box, the way that, sometimes other traditional schools kind of fall into. But Olga, I think I would rather defer to you as the expert on Fusion Academy.
No, I think that's a wonderful response, and I appreciate that. And Christy, I would love to speak further about your specific student. But I would say, I think a lot of it is just that individual piece of it. In the classroom, not having the anxiety of what your peers are thinking, your peers judging you, being put on the spot to ask a question, and the fear of your peers and what they're going to think and giggle, or, what they're saying behind your back. There are no peers in the classroom. It's just you focusing on your academics with a teacher you have a relationship with and trust. And then in the homework cafe, having that space of not being in a cafeteria of hundreds of kids, having a quiet homework cafe space where you can be by yourself and listen to music or read a book and unwind when you are done with your homework, to be able to have that balance of what allows you to feel safe and be able to also move out of your comfort zone when you are ready, working at your pace too. I think those are a lot of ways that we work with that social anxiety piece for our students.
Just wondering how do you get them to socialize, to do the exposure therapy, which was the CBT idea, I guess, within an environment where they're, only having individual contact? How can you mesh those two things? Like, how can she move forward? Because educationally, like I said, she's fine. She can learn in a group setting if she needs to, but it's the social element that's
part of
lacking.
that's going to involve the relationship that, you said you got a daughter, your daughter has with their therapist, right? Like, we're asking them to do something that's really scary. And so they need to feel understood and supported before agreeing to do that, right? So that would be the first step. Is a good therapist that your daughter likes. I mean, it's great if you like them too, but it's more important for your kid to like the therapist, quite honestly, because they're the ones that have to do a lot of the hard work. So they want to, they have to be with someone that they trust. And out of all of the factors, when it comes to, therapists, it's not, oh, they had this really fancy education or training or what have you, right? That's not what helps to heal, kids. It's the therapeutic relationship, right? It's the relationship between the two people, the client and the therapist. So that is tantamount to everything.
Yeah, and I think that's a big piece that transfers over to the school environment at Fusion too, is having that relationship and that confidence then with the homework cafe director and your teachers, and eventually joining student meetings or joining a student club and being in a small environment where you have that autonomy, but also grow that confidence is really important for our students. So they have the opportunities, and a lot of times it's just easing them into it, but knowing that the opportunities are there and ready when they're ready, because most of the students get ready, but on their own terms and timeline, as long as they have somebody supporting them outside of school and within the school environment.
So in the school environment, they're encouraged to try and at their own pace within, do the teachers recognize and they feel like, well, we should push this kid a little bit more out into the social world, she seems ready? Or is it all about the kid and the therapist and they decide and the school just operates in this sort of individual? So I'm trying to figure out whether it's how that works.
Yeah, we create individual goals for our students. So social emotional is part of it. And we recognize where the students' goals are, and as well as parents' goals. So the teacher may say, hey, Johnny or Susie, why don't you come staple packets with the student? Or, hey, it's Wednesday and it's student meeting. Why don't you just come and sit? What we have this really great club and you're interested in Dungeons and Dragons, why don't you come and observe? We have a student showcase. Do you want to showcase any of your new art that you've done? It's just these little things. It doesn't seem like one great revolutionary day. I think it's just little things that get added up that then
Incremental.
you look back and say, wow, I would have never done that before. And it's having those opportunities in an environment that is safe, allowing them to have those social. So it's a combination, Christy, of the teachers, the administrators, the peers, and the therapist working with the student outside of school, and the family communicating to us saying, this is what our child has shared that they are or aren't ready for, or they are and aren't experiencing.
Okay, well, thank you.
And it has to be incremental, right? We want change to be incremental, right? We should never trust change when it's a total 180 overnight, right? Because those are the changes that don't last. This school avoidance, is something that has to be done incrementally, and it's going to take some time.
Thank you for that question, Christy. And there's another question from Cindy that I definitely want asked. She asked, any helpful tips on helping a teen communicate? Hard to tell if there is, anxiety or depression and what is going on in his head to be able to help. So that is a tough one when a kid's not willing to share and communicate.
It is. I mean, is there anybody that they are willing to talk to? And, sometimes I don't have any kind of magical phrase or thing that you can do to get your kid to tell you everything, right? But I do know that, when kids feel like their parents understand the situation from their perspective and then validate their experience and their feelings, that can, warm them up to being more open. Then again, for some kids, like our autistic kids, sometimes it's really hard for them to share what they're thinking and what they're feeling. And so, sometimes it requires kind of careful observation and detective work, to notice patterns of behaviors and things like that with them. So yeah, I don't have a magic answer for you. sometimes it helps though, like, I've noticed, like, with my own kids, if they don't really want to talk about something, I feel like every time, this is just kind of anecdotally, like whenever like we're driving in the car and like we're not making eye contact and they're in the back seat and it's like dark out, like lots of big reveals will happen because, the pressure is off of them. So just anecdotally, that might help.
And there's a question about, is there a psychologist on staff at Fusion, Rockville, or other locations? And the answer to that question, I just want to address, is no. We are not a therapeutic school, even though there is a lot of therapeutic components thread throughout the program. So if the family does not have support yet outside of school, we would work to help you find the resources. And if you do have support outside of school, we would work to connect with them to work as a team.
But Kelly Ellison raised their hand.
Oh,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I was going to put my question in the chat, but it was way too much typing. I realize we're almost out of time, so I'll be quick, I hope. I'm working with a youth, and he's in elementary school, has an ASD diagnosis, fairly newly diagnosed, and we're not to the point of school refusal yet. However, I was taking note very intently when we were talking about staff perception of ASD and how they work with the children, or sometimes don't work with the children, and perceive that diagnosis. Families struggling, and with the way that the staff is not working with the youth. Any suggestions that you can offer that maybe I'm kind of at my limit with ways that tips that I can offer to the family?
Yeah, is it a thing where like the teachers are inflexible with the student, or like, I mean, not to get too specific, but like,
Sure. Staff, admin, teachers, all of the staff are kind of at their wits' end with, and that's through the IEP support services and accommodations, the BIP, everything. It's just not we've gone through the gamut of things that aren't being followed and done. And I know like the proper channels of ways, but this little guy really loves to learn and wants to be in school, and it's just not working out. So we're just trying to maintain some form of communication and getting them to understand that it's ASD that's doing
this is
this,
how they're
not this
wired.
little person.
Right. This is their neurology, not their character, right?
Right.
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 I mean, I guess, anecdotally, like what I often recommend for parents to do is like at the very beginning of the year, like, have like a meet my kid, 1-page bullet pointed. Hey, here's the thing, right? Like, this is what they really like. This is what is harder for them. And here is my information. Call me anytime, anywhere, any place if you have any questions. So that way you can kind of troubleshoot right away and open the lines of communication right away, so that it doesn't build and build and build. And then everybody has these negative, perceptions of this kid who really is trying to navigate his best to navigate a world at a school that wasn't designed with his brain in mind. If it really gets, really bad, then you might want to consider, like an alternative placement for him. Like maybe that's just not the right fit school for him. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I know we're at time, and I want to respect everyone's Friday. So thank you for the wonderful engagement, everybody. I appreciate people staying till the end to have questions answered. I will, like I said, I will send you all the presentation, the recording, the resources, any additional questions you may have afterwards. You will have Dr. Doyle's contact information, so you're welcome to follow up.
Yeah.
And a big thank you to Dr. Megan Doyle. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, your expertise, sharing your time to be able to do this. We are so grateful for you and the Stick-Through group to be a resource in our communities to support the kids and the adults in our community. So thank you for all the hard work that you do and for your time again.
You got it. Thank you. Right back at you. And all of you, Yeah.
Thank you everyone for being part of our community. Enjoy the beautiful day that we are gifted today. Take care. Have a great weekend.
Bye, everybody.